Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rhonda Hoffman. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library here in Buffalo, New York. The Grosvenor Room is where I work. It's our special collections department where we have genealogy, local history, maps, rare books, and music scores. The only time you ever need to make an appointment to come to the Grosvenor Room is if you wanted to view a rare book. Otherwise, we're open the same hours as the rest of the library. Today's topic is Anatomy of a U.S. Military Pension File, and the focus is on from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War. So today we're going to talk about what you can learn from a pension file and pension file access. The different military service era: the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Indian Wars, the Mexican War, and the Civil War. So who may have received a pension? The laws varied from time to time, but generally soldiers who were survivors of the wars may have received a pension based on their disability or sometimes their age. Family members, especially widows. And then for the Civil War, other family members such as dependent parents and siblings, and also children might have received a pension. Pensions were given according to U.S. laws. The laws did change over time, and there could be dramatic changes of the law in short periods. So one year there could be a particular law, and then a year or two later, something may have drastically changed about the requirements in order to obtain a pension or what a soldier would receive for a pension. Usually over time, the laws became more lenient as there were less surviving soldiers of a particular war or when the country was doing well financially. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on how you look at it, a lot of times the laws were put in place in order for political gain. So that's when you see a lot of changes happening to the law. If people were usually pro-pensions, and politicians would change the laws in order to get votes. So this class isn't going to be about all the different laws, but I did want to just give you some examples of some of the laws that were in place. And this is just a selection. Like I said, there could be many, many changes to different laws, but I did want to kind of give you an example. Sometimes you'll see certain timeframes, there was more of a surge of people applying for pensions, and it may have to do with, it usually has to do with the changes in the laws because they might have made it easier for people to apply. So before 1806, for example, Revolutionary War pensions were only for the Continental Army, not state militia. So in 1906, they became open to state militia. So you might see a surge of people who fought from state militias trying to get a pension. In 1832, every officer or enlisted man who had served at least 2 years in the Continental Line or state troops, volunteer or militia, was eligible for pension of full pay for life. Naval and Marine officers and enlisted men were also included, and the veterans who served less than 2 years, but not less than 6 months, were eligible for pensions of less than full pay. In 1836, widows of veterans who met the criteria for the 1832 law could get pensions. And that part of that rule is that the widow had to be married to the veteran before the expiration of his last period of service. And then there were a few laws changing that marriage date. So in 1838, the wife had to marry the soldier before January 1st, 1784, and then it changed to 1800. And then in 1853, all restrictions pertaining to the date of marriage were removed. And then in 1878, if there were still widows who survived, the soldier only had to serve for 14 days or were in any engagement, and they were declared eligible for life pensions. For the Civil War, some major changes. Let's see, as in 1862, soldiers who were disabled were eligible for pensions, and dependents of soldiers who were killed in duty were also eligible. And there might be a surge around 1879 because there was an Arrears Act, which provided veterans a lump sum payment to cover the time from when they left the military and when they applied for a pension, so they could get that back pay. And then a major surge happened in 1890 with the Dependent Pension Act, which expanded eligibility to veterans who were disabled, even if the disability was not a direct result of the war. Before that, the disability had to be a result of the war. And they only had to serve for 90 days and have an honorable discharge. In 1901, remarried widows who became single again through either death of their subsequent husband or divorce at no fault of their own could obtain a pension. And then in 1907, old age was considered a disability. So if you reached a certain age, in 1907, it was 62 years old, you could get a disability for that. As you're looking through pension files, you'll notice different citations to laws. So this is how you can try to figure out what your what law your ancestor might have applied under. Sometimes there were exceptions to the legislation that was in place, and that could be done through private legislation. So laws made for a particular person. And for that, you would usually look in the U.S. serial set, and there'll be information about that in your handout. So what can you find in a pension file? So about a soldier, you'll often see details of their military service. This is an example from a War of 1812 pension file. And usually when they first started applying for a pension, they would make their first declaration. Sometimes they would be on these pre-printed form, but for the really early applicants, that might not have taken place. It might have just been something handwritten out. So this is for one of my ancestors, Elias Fancher, who lived in La Martin in Fond du Lac County in Wisconsin, and it lists his wife's name. And it also lists when he enlisted on the 1st of July, 1861. And he was drafted into Abram Madison's company. And then he left around the 1st or 2nd of January in 1864 at Buffalo, New York. And down towards the bottom, it gives some details of his service. It says he served 3 weeks at Oswego, New York under Captain Webb in the months of June and July of 1812. Also 3 weeks at Genesee River in, he thinks, Captain Leonard's company about the last of August 1812. Also 4 weeks at Lewiston under Captain Leonard in December or November of 1813. And that he was in one battle between Black Rock and Niagara Falls about 2 days before his discharge. This is from my ancestor Aretas Root. This is also a War of 1812 pension. And it tells that he was taken prisoner. So he says on the 11th day of September, 1814, he was in a battle at Fort Erie and was taken prisoner on that day and taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And he was kept in prison until March of 1815. It also lists his marriage and residence details. It says that he's been a resident of Bellevue in Eaton County, Michigan for 16 years. Sometimes soldiers were required to keep a very detailed list of where they lived from the time they were discharged until the time they applied. This is from my ancestor, James Bentley, who was a Civil War soldier. And you can see his listing. He moved around quite a bit, kind of in close by areas in Potter County, Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, New York, and Cattaraugus County, New York. So these can be a great way to track your ancestor. Physical descriptions are often given. This is a relative of mine, Samuel Root. He was, when he applied for this, he was 41 years old. And it says that he was 5'6". He has a light complexion, light hair, and blue eyes. It also lists his health and disabilities. So usually soldiers would get these pensions, as I mentioned earlier, due to different health problems and disabilities. This is from 1885. And it says that he contracted rheumatism caused by exposure living in rebel prisons for 18 months. He was a prisoner of war at Andersonville prison. I thought this was interesting. In 1886, one of the pieces of paperwork that he put in, it told specific treatments that one of his doctors told him to take: Primley's iron and Wahoo bitters. And you can see their health and disability changes over time. You know, the more health problems that you got, the more money you usually got. So if at the start, if they didn't give you full disability, there were different schedules as far as how much money you would get depending on what health problem that you had. So as time went on, it was in your best interest to tell how if you were declining, to provide that information. This is from 1898. And it says that he had, that he had head and back injuries from a runaway accident. He was, later on, that accident is very detailed and there are witnesses to the accident. He was with others trying to pull a threshing machine into a barn, and the horse ran away and he was injured as a result of that. He also has heart trouble and also stomach troubles due to the bill of fare in Andersonville and other prisons. He also had chronic diarrhea. Sometimes you'll see if your ancestor was discharged due to a disability, you might see that paperwork. This is for my ancestor, James Bentley. And a lot of soldiers, you'll see that they had chronic diarrhea. And that was why James was disabled. So the amount that was given to a soldier, it was dependent on disabilities, but it was also dependent on rank. So if you were an officer, you would get more money dependent on your rank. So there was a favoritism to officers, and a lot of people didn't like that. And one of the other things that seemed very unfair and in favor to officers is that pensions were generally based on the ability to perform manual labor. So officers often worked white-collar jobs where they weren't doing manual labor, but their pensions were based on manual labor. So even if an officer could work their full-time job because they weren't doing manual labor, they could then still get a pension because of whatever disability that they have. So they could get a lot of extra money, and they're already making a lot more money than the blue-collar enlisted men. And another bit of unfairness is a lot of times to prove that they were due a pension, an enlisted man would have had to get information, get affidavits from witnesses, especially officers or military doctors. And sometimes that wasn't required for officers to do that. And I read a really interesting article about this, and it will be listed on your handout, and it's called Great Injustice, Social Status and Distribution of Military Pensions After the Civil War. And it tells, certain officers said, I'm not answering any of those questions or writing affidavits for anyone, or a doctor did not have to provide that information. So it was very unfair and difficult sometimes for enlisted men to get witnesses to their disabilities. Sometimes you get a little bit of the person's personality. This is from Samuel Root again, and it says, I never made an application for pensions before because the Republican Party was in power, and I never asked any favors of them and did not expect any. I'm a ranked Democrat. I voted a Democrat ticket ever since I was 21, and Samuel J. Gilden was the first Democrat I ever helped elect, and they stole away from him. And I said that I would never vote for a Republican for Poundmaster. You really want to mine these papers for friends and family members. These are usually who will agree to be a witness for you. There could be witnesses to a soldier that they fought with. So a witness to their military service, because a soldier would have to prove their military service in order to get a pension. There could be witnesses to a disability. So if someone saw you get injured during the war or right after they came back from the war, if they had a particular illness or physical impairment due to the war, people would testify for that. And in Samuel Root's file, we see, and there are 4 different Spaldings that I see giving affidavits for him. We see a Silas Spalding here and a Joseph Spalding. So clearly he was very close with the Spalding family. And one of the statements made on these declarations having to do with his disability from Silas Spalding says, we both came out of the Army about the same time. I have known said claimant ever since he was about 5 years old and been with him more or less. If your soldier had previously been enslaved, you may see details about that. This is from a 1906 application, and the application form actually asked, were you a slave? If so, state the names of all former owners and particularly the name of your owner at the date of your enlistment. And this gentleman, Robert Brown, says he was owned by Henry Forrest and his brother, and he left there to join the Army at New Orleans. Another question that could be very helpful for the formerly enslaved, as they might have been known one name right after they left their enslaver, and they might have changed their name later on, is, have you ever been known by any names other than given in your application for a pension? And he says no. But that could be very revealing and helpful in finding other records. So, I mentioned family members could also get pensions, and all pension claim materials pertaining to a particular soldier or his family are included in the same file. So you don't need to look for a number of files. You could search for the soldier's name, and then you could, all of those records will be all together. This is an example from a pension index. And you can see the soldier's name at the top, Turner H. Chappell. You can see there's a spot for widow or minor. And then usually if someone else applied, which was less often, they would be written down here. So this person's mother, Harriet Chappell, applied for a pension under him. And when you look at these, you can tell whether they got a pension or not. Usually there'll be the initial application, and this is her initial application number. And then if you see a certificate number, that means that they received a pension. If you don't see one, that would indicate that they tried to get a pension, but they couldn't get one. So your ancestor just needed to apply, and you could find all of this great information in a pension file. So they don't need to have obtained a pension to have a file. So pensions for family members, generally there were only widows' pensions outside of soldiers' pensions until the Civil War. And there was kind of a hierarchy. You can, on your handout, there's going to be a lot of links, a lot of listings to different books that give pension laws and history of pension laws. And usually there was a hierarchy to who could get a pension. So the widow would usually have the first priority after the soldier passes away. The soldier would have to be deceased generally in order to get a pension. Then legitimate children, and that did have to be proven that they were legitimate. They were very concerned about the social mores of the time. You'll see that in the different pension files. Then a dependent parent, and then dependent siblings. And those dependents would have to prove even more. So if a dependent applied, it's even better information for you. So a dependent would have to prove the soldier's service. They would have to prove their relationship to the deceased soldier. The widow would have had to prove that they were not remarried or cohabitating with someone else. They had to state that they were supporting the soldier's children properly. And sometimes they would have to prove financial need, depending on the laws. Other family members would have to prove their dependency on the soldier. The deaths of other persons in the hierarchy. So, that the widow was deceased, whether or not they had children could be in there. Mothers, usually they would be dependent on their husband. So if a mother applied, she might have to prove why her husband was not capable of supporting her. And for certain different things happened, but for a certain time frame, the parents would have to prove that at the time that their son was in the military, that the son was willing or was supporting them at that time. Sometimes things had to be proven of a specific time period. So it couldn't be like 20 years later, this mother needed a pension for certain time frames, and she couldn't take care of herself at that time, but she might have had to prove that at the time her son was in the military, he was supporting her and she was incapable of working because of certain disabilities. So here's an example from a Revolutionary War widow's pension. This is an affidavit from a witness to a marriage, since there weren't marriage records kept. And that was a difficulty because, before the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of times marriage records and birth records aren't kept. So this is an affidavit of Hannah Hamlin of the town of Moreau in Saratoga County. And it says, saith that she was 77 years of age on the 4th day of March last, that Martha Munson of Portland in the county of Chautauqua in said state is sister to this deponent. That said Martha Munson is about 4 years and 6 months older than this deponent. And the said Martha was married to Samuel Munson at her father's house in the town of Bristol in the county of Hartford and state of Connecticut by the Reverend William Robinson in the town of Southington in Connecticut, sometime in the year 1783. This deponent was at the wedding and saw them married, and that was from an 1843 affidavit. So look at all that great information about a very early marriage. And it even says where their father lived. I would say, especially for Revolutionary War pensions, you might see that people, as proof, would submit pages of Bible records. And this is for that same Munson family. And the arrow points to, and they were married February the 3rd in 1789. It also lists all of their children's birth, as well as the births of the couple that was married. Sometimes you'll see sort of official transcriptions of records. So this is from a Roman Catholic Church record. This is a Civil War widow's pension. And it says, I certify that the bearer, Bridget Mullen and Thomas Joyce, he was the soldier, were married according to the rite of the Roman Catholic Church in the year of our Lord, 1858. And it tells the priest's names, and it says of Clifton, though it doesn't give any more specific information than that about the location. So you've learned their religious denomination there. And sometimes people would turn in or sort of narc on other people. So this is that same widow, Bridget Joyce. And someone named Patrick Joyce writes, I hereby inform you that Mrs. Bridget Joyce, widow of Thomas Joyce, who is a fireman in the U.S. Navy, and on whose account she draws a pension, was married in Ireland in the year 1866 to a man named Patrick Foley. She brought her husband here about 1 year ago and lived with him in 20th Street between 34th and 4th Avenue in Brooklyn. She passed as Mrs. Foley, his wife, while she lived in Brooklyn. They have both gone home to Ireland. I can get an affidavit from a woman named Mrs. Roach with whom they lived while in Brooklyn, showing that she lived with him as a wife. And then it says his name and where he lived. So I suspect that, maybe this was his brother or cousin of the soldier, and he was upset because Bridget was still drawing a pension on their family member. I asked the National Archives if they knew if witnesses like this would be paid. And they said they've seen a lot of it in examples and they suspect it's just they had their own reasons. I did see some more recent than this laws, like early 1900s, where it said that a witness could be paid according to a certain schedule, so that he may have received money for this as well. And if you did have an ancestor who was, say, an immigrant, and then they moved back overseas, they could still draw on a pension if they were overseas. This is, again, related to Bridget Joyce, and it says she drew her pension by power of attorney from England for 6 months from 1st January 1866 to July 1866 in August of that same year. This is again related to Bridget Joyce, and it was from 1904. And she must, though it wasn't in the pension file, sometimes you'll see that it seems like certain documents aren't in the file, and that was the case for this. It's addressed to Bridget, and it gives her address as a poor farm in Lewiston, Maine. And it says, in reply to your recent letter, you are informed that payment of your pension to the widow of Thomas Joyce, late of the U.S. Navy, was discontinued because of your remarriage and that you are not entitled to further pension as his widow. And I kind of wonder about this one. I looked her up before this time frame and she's listed as a widow. And for this time frame in 1901, the law was that if you were widowed after a subsequent marriage or divorced, and the divorce had to be of no fault to the widow, that you could have obtained a pension again. So I wonder if the commissioner just didn't know, wasn't up to date on the laws. The federal government was very concerned with fraud, and they would really look into the marriages of women. And so this is one of my ancestors. This is James Bentley's wife, Elizabeth Bentley. And there was a lot of detail about the family. Sometime in the year 1869, James Bentley and his wife were living at or near Millport, Pennsylvania, with several children, 7, I think. During that year, they separated. Bentley came over into New York for a while, but not long. His wife remained at or near Millport. Then she too drifted away where it is not known. In 1871, December 26, I believe, Bentley was married to a woman by the name of Elizabeth Ray, the present widow by Frank Larrabee, Justice of the Peace in Cattaraugus County. And they lived and cohabited together until his death, which occurred on the 22nd of March in 1897. And that they have 7 children, 4 of which are under the age of 16 years, and that he was drawing a pension, and that the children are, they're all in need. The children by his first wife are grown up, and at the time of their separation, they were separated amongst family friends. And about the year 1875, his first wife married a man by the name of McCarty, and they can't find the first name. And they had a child, a boy. And he's been unable to learn whether McCarty is alive, but he thinks not. And that he's been able to learn the place where the marriage took place or whether the child is still alive. And he has proof that Mary died in the almshouse at Burlington in Bradford County, Pennsylvania on December 15th, 1897. So a lot of great information even about a previous wife to try to prove the legitimacy of the marriage. And unfortunately, Elizabeth was not granted a pension because she wasn't deemed his legal wife, because James and his first wife were not legally separated or divorced. And the widow, the first wife, was still living at the time that James passed away. And James just passed away a few months before his first wife. So, it makes me wonder if they would have given her Elizabeth the pension if the first wife had died before James did. Here's an affidavit about one of Bridget Joyce's children. And it says that Patrick Joyce, a minor child, was born in Clifton County of Galway, Ireland on the 13th day of July, 1859, and was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church at Clifton about 4 days after his birth. So here we're learning, those foreign places of birth. And I just wanted to test this one out. So I looked for the Irish Catholic Church records in Omi, which is the Roman Catholic parish for Clifton, and I did see a baptism for Patrick of John, and it looks like it's spelled J-Y-E-S instead of J-O-I-C-E, and Bridget Mullins, and that was her maiden name. And I did find in Griffith's valuation, which are land value listings of tenants of land and the landowners and the value. And there are Mullins and Joyce families in that town of Clifton. So if a widow drew a pension, she could usually get some extra money if she had children who were under 16 years old. You would see declarations for pensions from widows, these forms that may have had to be filled out, and you'll see listings of children. So here we see Minna Cogdell, and it lists her maiden name was Darden. And it lists all of the children and their dates of birth. And 2 of them had passed away. And it does say down here, 2 of the children passed away. And it says Nanny and Isabel passed away. In a different pension file having to do with a soldier, Caesar Counts, his widow applied for a pension. And I found that it was an incredible file for tracking family and friends and the history of their enslavement. This is a deposition by Christopher Green for Mary Counts, who was the widow of Caesar Counts. He was age 59, a ditcher in Newbern, North Carolina. And it states, I knew Mary Counts, now Simmons, when she was supposed to be Green, a slave of Lafayette Dillahunt in Jones County, North Carolina, knew her from a girl up to the present time. I belonged to Dick Green, whose plantation was 3 miles from Mr. Dillahunt. Caesar Counts was a slave of the same man that owned Mary Green, for Mr. Dillahunt bought Caesar from Joseph Kinsey. Caesar Counts and Mary Green were married in 1857 or 1856, somewhere about that time, with the consent of their owner, Mr. Dillahunt. They lived together, drew their weekly rations as man and wife, and were recognized by their owner as man and wife. Caesar and Mary were married as slaves were in those days. They lived together until the time of his going to Yankees. And there are statements from multiple people in this file having to do with enslavement and their enslavers. This was a difficulty especially for the widows having to prove the marriages, because oftentimes slave marriages weren't permitted. And there could be, a lot of sensitive nature to these files. For example, in listing of children and proving that you were married to a particular man, of course, there could have been sexual exploitation by the slaveholders, and you may see details of that. If they had children from other men, they may have had to explain that to the inspector. There is a very good article, and this one is going to be listed on your handout as well. It's called Her Claim for Pension is Lawful and Just, representing Black Union widows in late 19th century North Carolina. It's really a great article, and it follows a particular claims agent and the tactics that he used to try to convince the pension officers that his clients should get pensions. Sometimes within the different applications, you might see the type of evidence that was required to prove the individual facts. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but just know that those are often in there. Sometimes there could even be a file pertaining to a particular soldier from a non-family member for certain timeframes. Someone may have been able to apply for a reimbursement if they provided certain services. Say if the soldier died and he didn't have any family member who took care of them, someone else might have cared for them. This is for Robert Brown. and a man cared for him when he had tuberculosis near the end of his days. And there was a whole questionnaire that had to be filled out. I would say, you know, some of these questions he definitely did not know the answer to, but he did know that the gentleman died of consumption, and his sickness began about 4 years ago, and that he cared for the man beginning June 10th, 1910, until the date of his death, which was October 22nd, 1910. So you will get some of those details, even from those files. And there was a whole listing of expenses and what had been paid. So it could give you some more leads to try to track down, for example, this gentleman's physician, the undertaker, the cemetery, money to a man for digging a grave. And this John Bennett, it says he's listed as nursing and care and hadn't been paid yet. He's the one applying for this. And within that file, there were these, you know, different receipts. And, you know, this could be great besides the fact that, you know where certain businesses that took care of certain services, you know, it's just something to think about, documenting local businesses. So if you think your ancestor who owned a business might have provided some kind of service that might have been mentioned in a pension file, it could be worth a look to find some local soldiers who might have had pension files. So this is one of my ancestors' son who was trying to get reimbursement for caring for his father, who was a War of 1812 soldier, and he was a principal at grammar school number 19 in Buffalo. And it says his name there, M.A. Root principal. So I thought that was pretty neat. You got to see his stationery. And, you know, just fun stuff, things that I kind of deem could be frameable things, you know, something cool to kind of look at and maybe hang on your wall. You could find that kind of thing in pension files too. When you're looking through pension files, you may also see references or paperwork having to do with military bounty land. So sometimes soldiers could get bounty land. Bounty land was granted from 1788 through 1855. So Civil War veterans did not get bounty land. So this is free land given to them from the government. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but you might see that a military bounty land was combined in your ancestors' pension file or reference that they received bounty land. And I will say that it is worth your while to try to get the military bounty land file too, because there could be other details in those files. And I've seen some paperwork in one of my ancestors' War of 1812 pension file, but there was more in a separate file too. So always try to track down those bounty land files. So accessing pension files, you can order copies of pension files from the National Archives. And you can just go on their website. This will be on your handout and you can order copies. But of course, some of these are online. The main places that you can find some of these are Ancestry.com or Ancestry Library Edition, Fold 3, Family Search. Some are in the National Archives online catalog, and some are in Heritage Quest Online. And I'll talk about each of them briefly. I'm going to stop sharing my slide, and I'm going to go onto the internet live for you. So one database that is available through the library is called Heritage Quest Online. And you go to the library's website, buffalolib.org, and click Research and Resources, and then go to Databases. Heritage Quest can be used from home with your library card. And from home, you would put in your library card right under where it says database A to Z. And then if you click genealogy, you can select the database of interest. So if I click Heritage Quest, it will open. Heritage Quest has Revolutionary War pension files in it. You can click the search button and you'll see different categories of records that are in Heritage Quest. And you just click search military records. And here's the Revolutionary War pension files. Let's see. And it's really easy to search these. Usually you can just put in the person's name. If you have a very common name, you may want to put where they lived or any event. For any event, you could put where they lived at the time they applied for the pension or where they had their military service if they moved. And you just simply click search. Oops, you know what, I made a typo. I did an M instead of N. So here's my ancestor, Samuel Munson. And you can see there was a widow's pension in 1844. And if you just click on the image, it will open up the file. Pension files can be very long. They could be something like 20 pages. They could be over 100 pages. They're really usually pretty massive. In Heritage Quest, and these are in Ancestry as well. These are on Family Search 2 and Fold 3. The National Archives, first they microfilmed these records, and they microfilmed just what was most pertinent to genealogy, and they named those records selected records. So as you browse through the images, that first set of records, it's just some of the records. But if you keep going, you'll hit another cover sheet that says non-selected records. So then they microfilmed the entire file. Of course, I recommend that you look at the entire file because you never know what could be important to your research. So that'll be the whole file after that. I wanted to point out also in Heritage Quest, if we go back to search, I had mentioned that there could be private acts where someone who maybe the laws of the time didn't pertain to them, but they were really in need of a pension. They could have gotten a law just for them to get a pension. And for some reason, this isn't working today. But one of the places where you might see those is the US serial set. And a big chunk of the US serial set is in Heritage Quest. And there are other places online where you can access the serial set as well. And I will put that, or it will be on your handout. So you could search for your ancestor's name in the serial set and see if they might have gotten a pension that way. Next, we will have a look at Ancestry. So I'm just going to go back to our database page, and I'm going to select Ancestry Library. The library has access to Ancestry Library Edition, and this is almost the same thing as Ancestry.com. And you can go to the search menu, go to military. And if we're looking for pension records specifically, you can click the pension record category. You could search this if you'd like to. You could search everything if you want. This is Lyman Root, and he lived in Livingston County, New York. And I find it helpful if you think the widow might have gotten a pension to put her name there. And sometimes she's listed as Julia. I've seen her listed as Julie. So I'm putting JUL asterisk. So it'll bring up those various endings. And I'm going to click search. And here's a Lyman A. Root. This is simply the index to the Civil War pension files. And this index is a little misleading because it does say the Civil War Pension Index. And it says from 1861 to 1934, but other wars are in this index. So think about this time frame. Most of the things in here date to 1917, but there might be some records a little later than that. When you look at the card, this is information that you could use to order a particular file. So you've got the widow and the soldier up top, and their daughter Clara also was eligible, so she applied. It gives his service details, Company G in the 136th New York Infantry, and it has the widow application number and the minor application number. They do not have a certificate number, so they did not get a pension, but there will still be a file for them. Just going to go back. So also at this pension search screen, you could view all of them in a card catalog. You could filter through your results if, you know, we're just talking about US pensions. So I'm going to click USA. There's about 72 different things. So sometimes there are things related. Sometimes states might have given some pensions as well. And those you might see. Some of these aren't necessarily pension applications, but some other documents associated with pensions. I'm just going to kind of filter these down, and I'm going to put pension and war. And you can sort your results. I kind of like to sort them by record count to see what's got the most records in there. So there's the Civil War pension in there. This is an index to remarried widow pension applications for the Civil War. You can see the War of 1812 pension index is in here. Here's the Revolutionary War pension files. So these are the same thing that was in Heritage Quest. And there are some other indexes as well. Next, I'm going to move on to family search. So if you're looking for an index associated with the Mexican War, you can go to family search. I'm just going to click search records. I'm going to go to find the collection. So here's the Mexican War Pension Index. And you could search that if you'd like. The next site I'll move on to is Fold 3. Of course, Fold 3 is a family search is a free website, but Fold 3, this is something that you'd have to subscribe to. The library does not have access to this one. So this is something you'd have to pay for on your own, but it is great. It does have a lot of military records in it. There is a project. This is where I would go to get War of 1812 pension files. There is a project where there's been a lot of funding to make these freely available. So the War of 1812 pension files can be found for free and used for free on Fold 3. I'm going to go to Browse, and I'm going to look for, I'm going to click see all here, and I'm going to look for War of 1812. I'm going to filter, and I'm going to put in pension. So there's the index, but then here's the pension files. And if you see here, you can filter by state or organization. These aren't complete yet, I should say that. If I'm just going to click on District of Columbia, and you just can see these are the surnames that pop up. They seem to be in the S's now. I don't know if the S's are complete, but they're into the S's. If you notice the different locations, there are states, and then there is U.S. Army, U.S. Marine, U.S. Navy, U.S. Volunteers. So the state militias are under the states, and then if they were federal troops, they would be under those U.S. categories. I wanted to show you, let's see. The index. And I'm going to find this one. You can't keyword search from where we are now, but I'm going to find the section for root. And this is my ancestor. And here's his War of 1812 index card. He did get a pension. Notice it doesn't have anything under bounty land. That is misleading. Let me show you another file. Under Ira root, there are some numbers here, and it might make you think that Aretas didn't have a land bounty file, but he actually does. There is actually a set of records that they refer to at the National Archives as unindexed bounty land files. And they're starting to index them on fold 3. So here it is, Bounty Land Warrant Applications Index. These files are just in alphabetical order at the National Archives. So, you should ask the National Archives, have them do a lookup for your ancestor. They're not too far into it. I think that they're just into the L's. So just so you know about those records. And the last thing that I wanted to show you, of course, you can keyword search these as well. You can keyword search across fold 3 for an ancestor, and you can find someone. So let's see here. One of the other things that's in here are some of the remarried widow Civil War pension files are in here. And I had shown you some samples from the widow of Caesar, Counts Maria. So you want to look for the multi-page file. You can see there's 128 pages. So some of those remarried widows files are actually in fold 3. And then finally, the National Archives catalog. You can keyword search these. So a lot of times the things that are on folds 3 through a partnership with folds 3, and after a certain waiting period, they become accessible for free through the National Archives. So you'll find Revolutionary War pension files in here. Sometimes other files are just in here. I know when you go to the archives, you can volunteer to scan files. So they could be in here because a volunteer decided to scan a file. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on. It's being very slow. So I would put in the soldier's name and try the keyword pension and then search. And here's a file, the approved pension application file for Robert Brown. And you can view that whole thing and you can download images from it. So that's everything that I have for you today. Again, this is being recorded. You will be emailed a link to the recording as well as the handout. Anyone who registered will get that. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.